Now, in this video, I would like to talk about federalism, and this denotes a relationship between the national government and state governments. As you already know from one of my week 1 lectures, federalism is a system of government in which an intermediate level exists between the national government and local governments. And in the United States, this intermediate level is known as the state level. Now, historically, we can talk about several stages that this relationship between the national and the state governments has gone through. The first stage is known as dual federalism. And in this stage, that took place roughly between 1789, which is the year that our institutions of government began to function, and 1932. During these years, each level of government, state and federal, engaged in its own functions. And the functions rather of the two governments would not mix. And the metaphor for this particular stage of federalism is a layered cake, because in a layered cake, the flavors and the colors are separate. They do not mingle. So let's say the federal government was responsible for national defense and for the printing of money, and state government would be responsible for public education. And so their functions would be distinct, very different, and they would stay out of each other's functions, of each other's jurisdictions. Now, the second stage is called cooperative federalism, and it began roughly in 1933 and lasted through 1963. During this stage of federalism, state and federal governments cooperated to achieve common goals. Not surprisingly, the second stage began during the Great Depression, when the national government stepped in order to assist the states and localities in dealing with the effects of the Great Depression, meaning high unemployment, desperation, the need to fix the economy, the resources of state and local governments, and even in combination with resources of individuals, charities, neighborhoods, communities, were deemed insufficient to get the country out of the Great Depression and back onto the path of prosperity. So the national government began to take a very active role in the management of the economy, and by so doing, it spilled its functions over into those functions that had previously been carried out only by state or local governments. That's cooperative federalism, and the metaphor for this is sometimes the marble cake, because in a marble cake, the flavors and the colors of the cake intermingle. Then from roughly 1964 to the present, we have centralized federalism, also known as cooperative federalism. Now, under this system, the federal government becomes the senior partner in the interaction with the state governments, and it can dictate to them what to do using financial leverage, such as grants, and also the fear of lawsuits. In other words, if you don't do what we think you should do, we will sue you. Now, from 1969 roughly to the present, some argue for the so-called conflicted federalism. They say that in this particular version of federalism, you have all the different types of federalism present at the same time, and you have to look at each particular issue to determine which type of federalism is really operative. So on some issues you have dual federalism, on other issues it's cooperative, and yet on other issues it's cooperative federalism that's operational. Now, what is the main leverage that the national government can use to get the states to do what it wants to do? I would have to say it's money. Through its system of grants, the federal government can attach conditions that state governments have to meet if they want to get the money. Now, there are different types of grants: general purpose, block grants, and categorical grants. Categorical grants are the most restrictive type of grants, and it's the type the federal government uses most frequently because it wants to tie the hands of the states and force them to do certain things if they accept the federal money. So the money in a categorical grant is designed for a narrowly defined purpose. For example, for building prisons. We're going to give you money, but what you have to do with this money is to build 2 prisons. Or we're going to give you money, but what you have to do with this money is to build 50 miles of roads, etc., etc. Other reasons for increased federal power, in addition to grants, would be Supreme Court decisions, starting in the 19th century with the cases that you have already met during our Week 2 lectures: McCulloch versus Maryland, Gibbons versus Ogden, Wickard versus Filburn. Supreme Court of the United States has handed a lot of power to the national government. Also, constitutional amendments. The 16th Amendment most of all, because it enabled the federal government to tax literally everyone's income. Before the 16th Amendment, the United States had no income tax, and the national government had to get its money from the states based on each state's population, from tariffs, meaning from taxes on imported goods, and from fines and forfeitures. But after the 16th Amendment was ratified, vast new money began to flow into the hands of the federal government, making it rich, so to speak, giving it the financial leverage over the states. Also, the changing nature of society, the American society has become a lot more mobile. And because people are moving around, they become less psychologically attached to their states. It's hard to believe now, but before the 20th century, the vast majority of people would not travel far beyond their local lake or local forest. But now in the 21st century, people move not just for travel. They actually they change their address quite often, move their place of residence quite often. And that certainly reduces psychological attachment to particular locales, to particular states, and focuses the psychological attachment in the entity of the national government. Wars and economic depressions force the country to work fast, to react fast. And when that happens, you tend to concentrate power in the hands of the national government, because that's the type of government that can marshal a lot of resources quickly to meet major crises like wars and depressions. And then once the national government acquires all these additional powers and all these additional money, it rarely wants to give them back. And then, of course, technology. The federal government is expected to be responsible for a vast array of complex technologies that are needed to protect the country and its people. Nuclear weapons is a perfect example. I mean, you're not going to trust your local Idaho or Nevada government with nuclear weapons. Not that there's anything wrong with governments of these states, but simply the Constitution of the United States vests national defense as a responsibility of the national government. And how do you defend yourself in the 21st century? Well, one thing that you do have, hopefully you never have to use it, but one thing that you do have is nuclear weapons. A very complex, very powerful technology. Who has control over nuclear weapons? It's national government that has control over nuclear weapons. Computer networks. The federal government has to be able to monitor, at least to some extent, computer networks and restore them in case they're damaged physically as a result of a terrorist attack or a natural event like a hurricane. Also, communications and information technology, everything from traditional phone lines and telephones, railroads, radio, television, interstate highway satellites, internet, what's important to understand is the national government doesn't have to own these. It does not even have to control all of these, but it has to have the technical capability to manage and to some degree fix all of these in case something goes wrong. And that puts tremendous power in the hands of the national government. And of course, we have seen that modern technologies can be used by leaders of the national government for surveillance purposes, to spy on the citizens, and for propaganda purposes. In other words, to spread a particular political message that the national government wants the people to hear. And this occurred a lot in a really some fantastic and outlandish ways in the 20th century. Particularly in other countries, but the United States has certainly not been immune from propaganda by the national government using these modern technologies like radio, like television, and internet in order to advance its agenda. What is the future of federalism? Now, political science doesn't have a great track record in terms of predicting the future. However, we can, I think, deduce some things from the very recent events. Now, one interesting development that we have seen is that the Supreme Court of the United States has been willing to limit the expansion of federal power under the Commerce Clause. Examples include such cases as United States versus Lopez, United States versus Morrison, and even National Federation of Independent Businesses versus Sebelius, the so-called Obamacare case, in which Obamacare itself was upheld as constitutional, but not because of the Commerce Clause, but rather because a penalty that you have to pay if you do not buy medical insurance is a tax based on the federal government's ability to tax, but not based on the Commerce Clause. So if you look at the traditional constitutional way in which federal power expanded, that way was Commerce Clause of Article 1, Section 8. So the interesting thing is the Supreme Court has reached its limit, it seems, for now, as to how far it is willing to expand federal power under the Commerce Clause. However, ordinary statutory law, meaning law passed by Congress and signed by the President, has gone in a different direction. We saw No Child Left Behind, even though it had been repealed by now. And the Patriot Act and the NSA data collection programs, all of these show how the national government is actually pushing its priorities and its agenda through federal law. So the power of the federal government, in my view, continues to grow. Neither of the two major political parties seems willing to make any appreciable reduction in the power of the federal government. Now, they will talk good game about reducing that power, Republicans in particular. This is one of the central points of Republican narrative over the last two generations, really, over the last 30 or 40 years. But what happens in actuality is they do not act to reduce the power of the national government. Quite the contrary, very often they expand it, as No Child Left Behind and Patriot Act and NSA surveillance indicate. All of these were begun under the administration of George Bush Jr. So Republican presidents, a Republican-controlled Congress sometimes expand the power of the national government, any rhetoric to the contrary notwithstanding. Democrats have shown willingness to cut the power of federal government by cutting the military, but there is incongruence because Democrats say, let's cut the military, and some of the cuts have been made. Republicans want to cut social programs, but those never seem to actually pan out, because if you look at what's happening at the end of the second decade of the 21st century, we have more people on various types of social programs. At the end of 2016, more than 42 million people on food stamps, approximately 73 million people on Medicaid. We have a lot of people on social programs. So this is a problem because the power of the federal government keeps growing. So as far as the near and medium term future is concerned, it is easy to see that the federal power is expanding even more, to the point where some say, well, the United States has federalism in name only. Um, and it is very hard to see such power diminishing in any significant way. So the power of laws, the power of money, and the power of technological control, and also the ability to sue, has given the federal government a lot of power. Everyone is afraid of lawsuits by the Justice Department. Everyone is afraid of investigation by federal agencies like the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, or the OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. The federal agencies like the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. Remember Eminem, but the FCC won't let me be me. So let me see. They try to shut me down on MTV, but it feels so empty without me. The powerful commissions seem to have vested so much power into the hands of the national government that even though technically we do have federalism and the Constitution guarantees certain powers to the states, in actuality, it seems like the national government has virtually all the power and can do pretty much anything it wants to do. And that which it cannot do directly, it can do indirectly by inducing the states to do it, by holding out the carrot and stick of grants, of federal grants, in front of them. Thank you.